Hello and welcome everybody to the One Fear Per Year podcast. Woo! With Mr. Chris Wilson. And this podcast really is to encourage, to give hope, to uplift people to this concept that walking through fear will change your life and change it dramatically and for the best. So Chris, I want to dive right in and just ask you about fears in your own life. Because, for instance, for me, I've dealt with a lot of fear of judgment, fear of criticism. Like, what are people going to say about me? I was a huge people pleaser in the past. So, what about for you? What have been some of the bigger fears that you've dealt with in your life?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Janice. Happy to be here. And as far as these fears, like I think I have a lot of similar fears as everyone else, whether that's fear of failure, fear of success, fear of judgment. But there's one thing above all that has really been a huge fear since I was like 7 years old, 8 years old. I remember going down to Florida with my family every year, and it was the fear of the ocean. And it's because something in that ocean, something there that I watched on TV and I watched from all these movies terrified me. And I did not like it at all. It was horrible.
So 7 or 8 years old, you had this fear of the ocean. When you were that age, did your parents, how did they handle that fear with you?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if they handled it with me. It was just like I can remember running on the beaches of Naples, Florida. That's where we'd go. My grandparents had a place there. So we go to Naples, Florida. And I remember like going in the water just like waist deep as, a 7 or 8 year old. So I'm super small. Waist deep is not that deep in the ocean. And I just remember like this feeling of like anxiety, this feeling of like, oh my gosh, what if I go in deeper? Like, am I going to get eaten by a shark? Like that was on my mind the entire time. So I'm not sure like my parents had kind of this concept of like teaching me about it. It was just something like I didn't like going in. I didn't like immersing myself in the water. And it was something I was just really, really afraid of for basically my entire life.
So, since basically your entire life, how has that played out in your entire life when you're doing ocean activities? Or do you just try to avoid ocean activities altogether?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as far as ocean activities, I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So we do not have the ocean there. For those of you that may know or not know, we have a bunch of lakes. So they're freshwater lakes. There's no ocean. There's no sharks. There's nothing that I wasn't, unfamiliar with there. But we traveled to Florida. We traveled down there, which was, on the coast, and I'd explore the ocean there or not want to explore the ocean there. And around 2009, I moved across the country in Canada to Vancouver, BC on the West Coast. And here we have ocean. Here we have much colder ocean than Florida. So it's not as swimmable, I would say. You can swim in it. But really, it was like tropical ocean. It was something where I knew sharks were, something I knew where a lot of different like fish and species were that I didn't want to go into. And that was a fear that took me all the way into like my late 20s. So around I was 28 years old when I started to face this fear a little bit more. And that's like a really interesting concept. I mean, we can dive into, I'm sure, as far as this episode, but it took me around 20 years. Just think about that, 2 decades before I started to actually like test the waters, so to speak.
And what was the catalyst for this decision to test the waters?
The catalyst, yeah. So the catalyst was my girlfriend at the time, and we went on a trip to Maui, Hawaii. And this is a little island, one of the Hawaiian islands on the West Coast, the Pacific Ocean. And so we went on this trip, and we're on this trip, and she comes up with the great idea of, hey, why don't we go snorkeling? Why don't we go snorkeling in the ocean? And I was just like snorkeling, like, okay, sure. So there was like some hesitation there. I hadn't really spent like much time in the ocean, like other than here and there, just like I said, like waist deep, maybe shoulder deep, but didn't really like explore too much. And so I was very hesitant at the time, like to go snorkeling, but I was like, okay, sure, let's go snorkeling. So we actually go on a boat, and the boat takes us out to the snorkel destination. It's called Molokini Crater. It's this crater off of Maui, off of the island. And so we go snorkeling. I'm feeling like anxious as we're on the boat. In my mind, constantly, I'm just thinking about sharks. I'm thinking about what happens when I'm in the ocean and this thing faces me, like literally face to face, and I'm unsure how to handle it. So we go snorkeling, didn't see any sharks, but it was constantly there. And that was like my first exposure again in the ocean 20 years later of putting myself out there, of getting uncomfortable. And she told me after the fact, she was thinking like how like I might be nervous on like this trip and stuff, but she didn't bring it up. Like she didn't bring it up. She didn't talk about it because I think she like thought I might like lose it a little bit during that time. So it was interesting.
And from that point, do you feel like you've done other things? Is this something like, okay, I'm going to face this fear once, do the snorkeling thing, and then I'm out? I don't really want to deal with it anymore. Or have you continually pushed through and done other things in the ocean to kind of face that fear?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting because that was kind of like the first encounter I would say of like putting myself out there and experiencing it. And we're both like really big water people. Like we love the water, we love swimming, we love like water activities, whether that's, I grew up wakeboarding and skiing and tubing and stuff in lakes in Ontario. And so we're big water people. And then it kind of got to this like idea or this concept of like, okay, like I can explore like over 70% of the world in the water because that's how much, ocean, that's how much water we have. And there's so much like cool stuff, whether that's reef, whether that's fish, whether there's like just unbelievable things you'll see in the ocean. And it kind of like got me thinking. So this was the catalyst, the first kind of part. And then slowly over the years, we started going to other places. So we end up going to St. Lucia for our honeymoon. That's a small island in the Caribbean. And as we're walking past the pool one day, like our whole goal on our honeymoon is to do nothing. Like we don't want to do anything. We want to chill. We want to lay on the beach. And so we're in St. Lucia. And by like the third day, we're like, okay, like what do we do? It's the third day. Like this is kind of boring sitting on the beach every day, like in the hot sun. So what do we do? So we're walking past the pool one day and there's this sign along the pool. And this sign says, "Discover diving." And so we looked at each other and we're like, that could be fun. Like that could be all right. And then that's kind of when the journey just continued on. And the next day we're in the pool, we're learning all about diving, scuba diving underwater, and we're learning all like the hand signals and breathing with a regulator underwater and learning the emergency procedures of like clearing your mask and all these different things. And then the next day we find ourselves in the ocean on a 30 to 35 foot dive in St. Lucia. And this thing is still going through my head of, what if I see a shark? Like, what if it happens now? I'm scuba diving underwater. I can't just surface immediately. Like I'm in it now. And then we didn't see any sharks on that trip. And this is kind of when the story continues into other locations of getting closer and closer to that encounter, to that fear.
Oh, okay. Don't leave us hanging, please. I want to know, have you come face to face with a shark?
Maybe. So our story continues. We find ourselves back in Maui, actually. We took a trip back to Maui. This was a year after St. Lucia. And we decide, okay, how do we go further? How do we explore more? How do we see more of the water and this amazing place underwater? And so we decide to become certified divers. We decide to get our PADI open water diving certificate. So we go to Maui on a trip and then we go 2 days. So 2 full days, about 5 different dives underwater there. This is about learning all the basics and fundamentals of diving. And we're underwater and we see giant sea turtles, like all these amazing things. If you've ever scuba dived in Hawaii, it's just unbelievable, crystal clear waters, but we didn't see any sharks. And then we find ourselves the following year, we're like, okay, we're feeling pretty good. Like I'm feeling a little more confident. And like, that's something I really want to point out as far as this fear. It's like my confidence is slowly growing. And it's because I'm putting myself out there just a little bit. And that confidence would never have happened if I didn't go snorkeling, if I never tried diving, if I never went to, Hawaii, St. Lucia, all these places and put myself in an uncomfortable situation. That was kind of what was happening. But again, we're talking 20, now 23, 24, 25 years it's been of having this fear. I'm like slowly kind of getting putting myself more out there in the ocean. So the following year after Maui, we're certified divers and we go to Cozumel. So we go to Cozumel, Mexico, absolutely beautiful location, second largest reef in the entire world next to Australia. And what's in Cozumel is there are a lot of sharks. They have healthy reefs, they have sharks, they have all these different things. And so we know the chances are pretty high of us probably encountering a shark. So we go there specifically for a dive trip. We're at a dive all-inclusive resort. All you do is dive here. You don't do anything else. So over 7 days, we dove about 18 times, 2 times at night, and the other 16 times in the day. And there's this one dive where we kind of come down to this reef, this shelf, and the dive master, the person in charge, looks up at us and he gives us this signal. And it's a signal that neither of us had seen before. And we're kind of looking at each other like, okay, what's going on here? And so as we descend down to the reef or under the shelf, we pull out our flashlights. Like having a flashlight, it's pretty common for diving. So we pull out our flashlights, we look under the shelf, and I'm getting closer and closer to this black bar under the shelf. And before you know it, I'm like 3 feet away from a shark's head underwater. And my wife's beside me and I look over at her and we back out. So we ascend about 10 to 15 feet in the water and the shark comes out. And now we're like really starting to like look at each other like, okay, the shark is out. It's swimming away from us down the reef. But then it turns and it circles the reef and it's coming straight for our heads. This is a true story. So the shark is getting closer to us and closer to us and closer. And now my heart's like going and pounding really hard. I'm trying to figure out like, what's the best way to do it to kind of get out of this situation or what's going to happen? It's just me and my wife in this one position side by side. She's on my right-hand side. And just before that shark gets to us, just before, it turns around and it swims away into the blue of the ocean. And that was about 25 years after I was 7 or 8 years old that I had literally faced my fear head on underwater. And now I want to do it again. Now I want to have more experiences like that. It was probably one of the best experiences of my entire life. And the crazy thing about this, and then I'll kind of stop talking here, is there wasn't fear in that moment. There wasn't actually fear when that shark was coming head on us. It was excitement. It was all these other things of amazement where fear was not present at all.
Oh, Chris, that is so beautiful. Everything you said, I was in that moment with you, and it's true in the present moment. The fear can just dissipate. The fear that had so controlled us, that so many times just in our minds. Really quickly, and there's no right or wrong answer, but if you were to say there is a word that is exactly the opposite of fear, what word would you say that is?
The word that comes in my mind, like in that situation specifically, was majestic. That was how the whole experience was, being underwater with, this fish that's been on the planet for over 350 million years. Like, that's what I was thinking. Like, this is like a majestic experience. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Last question, because we're running out of time in our bite-sized episodes. But since this is one fear per year, this is a journey. And we never stop growing. We never stop evolving. So if there's one thing in this upcoming year, one fear that you want to face and walk through, what would that be?
Like a fear for me personally that I want to walk through?
Yes.
Well, it's not sharks, because I've walked through that. I've swam through it. So it's not sharks. But I would say really like every single week, every single month, I try and get a little bit uncomfortable. And that could be going to a networking event. That could be speaking to a crowd that I'm not too sure of as far as the audience. So I'm always looking for those things of how I can get uncomfortable. So I don't know if I have like a specific, area or place that I want to kind of expose myself to a fear, but I'm always trying to kind of push my own boundaries of just getting a little bit further out there, just like I kind of did in this shark story.
Yes, always. And I know you're a very growth minded individual. So it's like pushing out of that comfort zone. And I know some people have said to me, one fear per year. I mean, that's cute because it rhymes and whatever, but really just one fear every year. And the reason I do that is because if we do one thing, it can feel not overwhelming. And then the cool thing is we build momentum off that one thing that we've done. And then, of course, we're going to do more than one in a year. But it just gives it kind of that idea that we don't have to pressure ourselves so much, but we want to be intentional about always moving forward and moving through our fears. So thank you so much for being an amazing guest and sharing your fear of the ocean, fear of a shark story. And it's just a beautiful illustration of the majestic things that we can encounter and experience right on the other side of fear.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thanks so much for having me, Janice. Love being here.
Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.